So I'm going to talk to you quite briefly this morning about something that's been really on my mind recently, and it was a conversation. Thanks, Gemma, for confirming you can see it. It was a conversation that came up recently when I had my head in my hands. I was speaking to a charity that we were working for, just about the plight of the world and everything that's going on. And she said to me, she turned around and said, "You know what? We just got to keep the fire alive," which I think was just a really powerful metaphor for what we all need to do right now. And so this little talk I put together was very much based on that idea about the importance of keeping the fire alive. So let me expand on it a little bit. So once you said that comment, I sort of went back and thought to myself, okay, what does it mean keeping the fire alive? And I was thinking, well, when we talk about fires in kind of metaphorical sense of what it means and storytelling, there's kind of I suppose, simple components to it, really. It starts ultimately with getting some logs. Obviously, you set those, let me see if I can make the skip. You set those logs afire. That creates warmth. And of course, when there's warmth around the campfire, it starts to spread. People come round, you put more logs on, it creates warmth and the audience grows. And again, I just felt that this was such a fitting metaphor for the importance of the stories that we need to tell. So just as a little bit of a backstep, I've been working in communications, in the storytelling business for almost 20 years now. And when I set up a small creative agency called Nice and Serious, with a mission to make creative work the world needs, and which basically means for the last 20 years I've been helping organizations to tell stories about things that really matter, essentially. But actually the journey started quite a bit before that. When I was 21, I'd just done a degree in environmental science, and my head was full of the theory of climate change, and I decided with a few friends to go on a cycle ride across the entire country from Land's End to John O'Groats, and with a trailer full of low energy light bulbs, starting conversations with strangers about climate change. And 1,000 miles later, and a lot of sazzle soreness, I came to the conclusion that nobody cared, or I think maybe more accurately or fairly, they had other more important pressing things to care about, making ends meet, for example. But I think that realization that people didn't care didn't really discourage me. It just made my mission a little bit clearer, that we needed to learn how to tell better stories to get people to care about some of the biggest, most pressing issues that we're facing, not just across the environment, but also society and equality too. We needed to tell better stories. And I think what really frustrated me at the time was that, why is it that if you were Nike and you were selling trainers, you could tell an emotional story about a bit of leather and a rubber sole, and yet when we were trying to talk about the plight of planet Earth or about the state of inequality and how it was growing, we couldn't put together a really compelling story? And that's really what I just set up Nice and Serious to do, to try and tell stories that really make people care about important things. And I think looking back, and this is going back to maybe what I might consider the heyday of the progressive movement that I imagine most of us were all part of, it just felt like our campfire was burning really bright. It felt like every story we told, whether it was about sustainability, whether it was about equality or justice, it seemed to catch, and it seemed like the media was fanning the flames, and it just felt like we were all united by that feeling that progress was inevitable. But I think looking back now, I would perhaps argue, with the benefit of hindsight, that we almost got a bit giddy about being on the right side of history. And I think I at least made the fatal assumption that everyone was broadly with us. And as a result, I think with that overconfidence, the storytelling kind of almost became a little bit heavy. I think we started to become quite scientific. Language we used, we started to become a bit sanctimonious, if I was being a bit critical, tying ourselves in linguistic knots. A lot of what we said, we would sort of caveat with, it doesn't mean this, it doesn't mean that. And often we would take aim at those who didn't conform, peers that were doing trying to good things because they didn't quite get the language right or it didn't appeal to it. And I think arguably we obsessed over perfection rather than just progress and moving things forward. And, you know, you could look at it, building on this metaphor of the fire. I think we started throwing like wet logs, if you like, on the fire. We started talking about net zero, we started talking about climate justice, we started talking about systemic equality. And don't get me wrong, these are fundamentally critical ideas that we need to push forward as society. But as stories, they're just wet logs. They just failed to catch. And I think while we watched our fire, this progressive movement, slowly fade, I think what we failed to realize was the populist bonfire that was blazing behind us. And this was a fire fueled by fear, by nostalgia, by, you know, by simplistic arguments to really complex problems. And I think we just, I wouldn't say we, I'm talking about me, but a lot of people that I know, we sort of just looked on, just stupefied by like what was going on. And I feel like our reactions were twofold. So for a start, I think our stories became quite reactive to the populist movement, to every flame. I think just totally aghast at the blatant lies, the undertones of national, not even undertones, just blatant nationalism, like the oversimplification of these incredibly complex problems. And by doing so, we were just fanning the flames. We were adding more logs to their story and making the problem worse. We were being drawn into their narrative. But on the other side of it, and I don't know if this kind of resonates with any of your experience, a lot of other organizations just fell silent, you know, whether that was progressive businesses or charities. I think whether it was just scared of friendly fire or getting burned, like a lot of people have just been quite quiet over the last few months, just for fear of stoking the far right or getting dragged into some kind of spat on X or something like that. And as a result, the flames have sort of gone out a bit. So, you know, and this is what I mentioned at the start of that comment, a kind of colleague mentioned, that the fire felt cold. It feels like our flames have gone out and the audience has sort of slowly drifted away. But I think, and I hope a lot of you would agree on the call today, that silence won't save us. You know, we can't just keep being quiet about what's going on and just watch the world move forward in a direction that we're not happy with. And ultimately, if we don't tell those stories, others will. And I think most of us, just looking on at what's happening in the world at the moment, will agree most of those stories don't end well. They're in the interests of a very small handful of very privileged people. So I think really what I'm getting at today is, I think maybe it's time that we need to start a new fire, just to really consciously create a new campfire, one that's built ultimately on better fuel, on better stories that connect with what actually motivates people, whether that is ideas of hope grounded in reality, stories about pride, about community, about belonging, stories that actually relate to the experiences of our audience, the lived experiences, stories that our audience can identify with, stories that might actually have a chance of leading us to act. Because I think one thing that I've become really conscious of over the last couple of years is that actually communications, storytelling isn't static. It's not about finding and crafting that perfect log, plonking it on the fire, and then job done, like wiping our hands and walking away, because ultimately every story has a shelf life. It's about constantly tending to that fire night after night, continuing to consistently tell stories that engage our audiences, and also accepting that our stories have to adapt to changing cultural winds to remain relevant, really. So I suppose my plea, my provocation, whatever you want to call it, is really that, you know, to everyone on the call, people that are working in progressive sectors, wanting to push forward progressive narratives, is really simple. It's just to keep telling stories, to keep adding logs to the fire, because I think now more than ever, we need that fire to burn bright again. So thank you. I'll end there.
My name is Katie Donovan Adekambi, and I'm an inclusion and cohesion specialist. I am the director of an organisation called BKCO, and we're out here working with organisations across sectors and across industries to build cohesive cultures and communities. The main kind of crux of what I do really is to challenge bias and systemic bias. And in order to do that, it's really, really important to have a really solid grounding and foundation in our understanding of equity. So I've got a few slides to take us through how we as an organization work with organizations and people building the change within those organizations. What do? I mainly work with organizations wanting to improve on their culture, but I also train a lot of allies, a lot of champions, and a lot of advocates in how to have difficult conversations, how to start to think about the infrastructure that they work in, and how to start to build the change when we think about systems. Okay. Now, to be able to do that, one thing that's really important, and actually, Tom, you really made me think about this, is knowing what your values and principles are is really, really important. Okay, incredibly important in being able to stand up with conviction for what you believe in. Because if you don't know where you stand, if you don't know what grinds your gears or fuels your passions, then it's hard to take a position on anything, really, anything coming through. So that's one component, values and principles. Another, okay, would be to understand equity, really, really understand equity, what it is and how we do it. Okay, so if I can jump 2 slides, please. What I want to do is just temperature check in the room. Okay, who knows what the 9 protected characteristics are in the UK? All right, and I just want us to understand what we're working with when it comes to what's protected by law. So if you could get your fingers at the ready, get ready to type for me. What is in the Equalities Act that's protected from victimization, discrimination, and harassment? Give them to me, people. Gender. Thank you, out the gates. Gender, what I will take is sex, because the language is sex. Race, thank you. Age, religion and belief, disability. Oh, you're on fire, people. Education, interesting. Education doesn't feature. Kind of wish it does, but people tell me, what would education, how would we judge? What category would that come under, education, if it was protected? Class, thank you, Colin. Class, exactly that. Thank you, Pamela. Okay, so education would come under class, and you know, that's a big part of our conversation here today. What else when we think about class and when we think about kind of protections of economic status, how else might we judge a person's economic status? Okay, marriage and civil partnership, thank you. Deprivation, income. It's an interesting one, people, because economic status is not protected. Okay, so I'm going to give them, if we can get the next slide. That was a wonderful attempt. Thank you, everyone. We got them all between us. Okay, these 9 are protected. All right, so economic status come through a lot and it's not protected. Okay, and we had education as a way of judging somebody's economic status, housing as another way of judging somebody's economic status. Any more ways in which, because what's quite ironic about the economic status not being protected is that there are loads of ways in which bias gets triggered. Accent is another one. Okay, thank you, Rachel, coming through with the accent. Clothing, career. Okay, what academic institution you attended, what postcode you live in. Okay, all these different methods of judging a person. Okay, weight, thank you, Agnes. So weight isn't protected either. So size can, people with different sizes can experience a lot of bias. Okay, and also another one coming through at the moment that you know, that women feel quite strongly about is kind of the menopause, and that being protected by the Act. You've also got kind of tattoos, and we can expand. Okay, we can keep going. When we think about what triggers people's biases to perpetrate maybe discrimination, then we've got these 9 which the law operate within. But if we think about our roles and we think about the organizations we work with, okay, how much more aware do we need to be about the fact that the 9 is actually quite limited? Okay, because people experience bias across this wide spectrum of identity markers that we've just talked about and that you've just popped into the chat. All right. So with that in mind, if I can get the next slide, please. I want us to think about this image, okay? And this image does the rounds a lot. There's lots of different versions of this image. But I just want to talk you through it, all right? And really, really draw on the differences here between equality and equity. Because when I'm working with organizations, what I often am met with is this conflation or a complete misunderstanding of what the two are, okay? And if we're going to do equity, we need to understand the difference between them. All right. So inequality, here we can see this person with lots of boxes, oodles of it. And for me, those boxes represent resources, wealth, finance, opportunity, connection, community. Yeah. And we look and we just have to look at what's going on in the world right now. We just, we cast our mind back to 2020 and when COVID hit, and there was no group left unscathed. Okay, there was no group. We had older people left out of contingency plans. We had the Black Lives Matters protests erupt on the international stage. Women disproportionately affected by domestic violence. The postcode scandal when it comes to academic results. Inequality is rife, and I know that everybody, I assume that everybody in this room is kind of involved in that in some way, and building the change in some way, and is very kind of got a heightened sense of consciousness to that. I think so. What happens then is organizations often and historically, okay, have gone for equality. Let's give everybody the same. All right, give everybody a box. It's easier. Then we don't have to deal with the conflict that may arise or the challenges that might get put forward. Let's just give everybody the same. But I ask you people, if I was to give everybody in this room £100, okay, to put it into perspective, for some people that might change their world in this moment. For others, okay, might not make much of a difference. For some, it would hardly go noticed. Okay, so when we think about being means tested, etc., this idea of equity is what kind of underpins that. All right, so equality is give everybody the same, and I'll tell you how else it sounds. Quite often we hear people say, I don't treat people differently. I treat everybody the same. Okay, I don't see difference. Yeah. That's how equality might sound. Now, it might sound good. It might feel even borderline humanitarian in the moment, okay? But what we're kind of saying is, I can't be bothered to see difference. I don't want to apply the skill or the knowledge or the insight into difference in this moment. I don't have the capacity for it. So I treat everybody the same, okay? When actually what we need to do is change and shift our mindset to this idea of equity. Okay, and in this image, when we see equity, we see that we've got somebody on a box and somebody on a ramp. Okay, and that individual in a wheelchair has had their needs assessed, right? They've had their needs considered, and they've had the right and reasonable adjustments put in place for them. Okay, now for disability, we've been doing this a long time. But the Equalities Act is an amalgamation of different legislation brought together in 2010, and we've been doing reasonable adjustments when it comes to disability for a long time. But what does that look like when it comes to race? What does that look like when it comes to economic status? What does that look like when it comes to gender inequality? What is the ramp equivalent if we want to do equity and do equity well, okay, across the board? Okay, now it's important that we start thinking like this, because there is a lot of oppression Olympics that seem to be taking a place in this conversation of late. A lot of comparisons about who's got it worse than the next group, who's got it, a lot of comparing and contrasting, and that can be really, really hard to manage and justify why certain people or certain individuals or certain groups, marginalized and otherwise, are getting equitable services. Okay, that takes into consideration the deprivation or disadvantage or the potential for victimization, harassment, or discrimination. So I want you to keep that thought close in your mind. What is the equivalent, the RAMP equivalent for the groups that you work with within your services? What is the RAMP equivalent for the individuals that you serve within your organization? Okay. Now, I often get accused of being idealistic for this last one, the whole liberation piece. But again, that fence represents maybe, toxic cultures, poorly written policies, unchecked personal internalized bias. Okay. And if we can get rid of those things entirely, we don't have to maneuver around the fence. Okay. We don't have to make reasonable adjustments to be able to kind of play the game. Yeah. If they're not there to begin with. The older an organization is I work with, the more deconstructing that we have to do within the system, within the infrastructure, and within ourselves as well. The younger, however, it's different. The younger an organization is, the less infrastructure there is to kind of review and undo. Okay. So with this image in mind, I want us to now think about intersectionality. Lisa, can you give me a time check, please?
Yep, you're okay. You've got about another 5 minutes.
Okay, all right. Quickly on to intersectionality. I'm not going to labour on this, but I just want everyone in the room to understand how, when we think about the 9 protected characteristics that flooded into the chat just now, that intersectionality is where multiple identities can exist simultaneously. So usually at the top of a session, I introduce myself as, dual heritage woman, I'm neurodivergent, I'm a working class girl, I'm a mother of twins. All those identity markers that I bring to the table are my experience and my lived experience. And because of how intersectionality shows up, that means my experience is quite unique and compared to some, and can compound my experience compared to others. So next slide, please, Madeline. And so this is an example of kind of how intersectionality works. Everyone here has an age. Everyone here will be ascribed a sex, okay, or identify with a sex, or gender identity. We all have a race, okay, and we all have a belief system. And how these identities kind of coincide and collide is what makes my experience in this world and how I receive your services quite unique. And so we talk about a cross-cultural kind of understanding, a cross-cultural literacy that needs to show up across the identity markers, and not just see people through the silos that are. And when we think about economic status, we all have an economic status too. And we know how poverty can make for an incredible vulnerability, okay? Incredible vulnerability to people. But you can be disadvantaged, and also from a different ethnic group. You can be disadvantaged and still have a disability. So I think understanding how intersectionality shows up for your end user, for your customer, for your patient, for your members is really, really, really important too. I just want to talk to the ACEs as well. If I can just get to the next slide, please. So we think about identity, we think about intersectionality and how identity shows up. And I'm sure that, again, I was told that most people on this call will be from public sector organisations or charity sector organisations. And I would hope that a lot of people would know what ACEs stand for, as in the adverse childhood experiences that people experience, right? So we've got, and here we've got a list of them. And so there are 10 that are measured. And so we can see them here, from kind of physical abuse to sexual abuse, domestic violence within a home that somebody might experience before the age of 18. Okay. Now, the report actually stipulates that if you've experienced one, that you're more likely to have kind of heart disease, I think, but more 40% more likely with just one adverse childhood effect. So we need to also take into account how trauma influences a person's kind of lived experience and how they show up in the world and how that affects their intersectionality. I would just like to say on this as well with the adverse childhood experiences, which if you Google lots of different resources, especially CAMS do have a lot of resources around adverse childhood effects for people that would like to do a little bit more research on it. What it doesn't necessarily take into consideration is racism. It doesn't necessarily take into consideration misogyny either. So they're not in the robust categorization. So we need to think again, like we did with the 9 protected characteristics. You've got the kind of the essentials that are covered, but what also sits outside of that? If we expand our thinking around this particular subject matter, where will it take us? What's a wider view on that? So with that in mind, if I can get the next slide, please. Thank you, David, for popping that into the chat for us. Thank you. So what I want you to think about now from your kind of organizational perspective or your sector's perspective is how are you doing equity? Okay, with all these themes that I've just introduced in mind, in terms of identity, in terms of a person's experience, and what they're bringing into the kind of space in the rooms with you. What is it that you're doing to apply equity for people, and what is your organization doing? So I currently work quite a lot within health and medicine. I did a piece of work, I've been doing a piece of work over the last 5 years around removing or combating racism in medicine and science. And the equity question is always at the core of what we do. The identification of where equity isn't and the identification of how equity can be done better is actually at the core of how we start to build the change, how we start to improve services and build quality improvement projects. So in maternity, for example, and I do a lot of work around kind of Black maternity because Black women are 5 times more likely to die in childbirth, according to the 2018 Embrace report. It's simple things that come through in how we can start to build the change. These women's pain threshold is disbelieved, for one. And that is one of the core reasons. And that is linked to a stereotype that women, Black women especially, brown women, are more resilient and they're stronger and they can take more pain. So they're left in their pain for longer. Okay, so what we get people to think is, how can we apply equity to this moment? Okay, and that is we activate as soon as we have a Black or brown woman enter our services. We recognize that they're just more vulnerable by the very fact that they're Black and brown in the color of their skin. And if that might result in longer appointments or more sophisticated consultation, then these are the kind of methods of equity that we need to start to draw upon. Okay, so I ask you again, I mean, I'll give you a maternity example, but when you think about your own services, how do you do equity? All right, and I'll just leave you on this thought, and again, drawing on some of Tom's thinking from the first presentation. A lot of equity is being undone at the moment, and yes, I think maybe we were in a bit of a progressive bubble of, you know, excitement for change and what was on the horizon, and what we've got now is what feels like, for me and other practitioners in this space, is a tsunami coming back the other way now, and an undoing of equity. Okay, an undoing. And what that looks like, and I'll give you a couple of examples. I've got a colleague who runs a trauma-informed organization and works quite heavily with prison services. And there's a layer of equity for young men, Black men especially, where before they're sentenced, some of their life circumstances are taken into consideration, and that currently is under threat. So that piece of equity before sentencing because we know already that Black and brown men have higher sentences and our prisons are disproportionately populated with young Black and brown men. So that was a little piece in kind of trying to level the playing field, if you like. I've also had another participant on a course describe recently that her nephew has neurodiversity, young primary school age, has a HCP plan. Is that the right acronym? And with that has the kind of times table and different kind of support put on his desk. Okay, so stuck on his desk to help him, times table, add in, taken away, etc. And this recently was taken away, okay, from him by a teaching assistant based on the fact that it was an unfair advantage, okay, and that everybody should be treated the same. So everybody being treated the same again takes us to equity. Okay, sorry, takes us to equality. We're back in equality because we're treating everybody the same because we don't want to give unfair advantage. Okay, but equity is really considering people where they are in their current circumstances and drawing on our cross-cultural awareness, literacy, insight to make sure that individuals get what they need at that individual level, which is cognitively taxing. It does require we engage in a more kind of thoughtful and deep way. And I think historically, people just want an easy life and convenience, and that's where we treat everybody the same approach comes from. So I feel like I've done enough talking. I might have even gone over my time, but I look forward to the panel. Any questions that you may have. And actually, if you can, Madeline, if you can just put the final slide on. I'm not the final slide, number 11. I'm on LinkedIn, people. No need, just I'm on LinkedIn, people. And if you want to connect, please do. Absolute pleasure.
Hi, everyone. I'm really excited to be sharing with you today and to kind of bounce off of what Tom and Katie said about how we can keep the fire going and how we can stop equity from being undone. And I think that really starts with listening to people and their lived experiences of hardship. So I'm here to spotlight what people told us during community research that we did on stigma and accessing support, and how their experiences help explain why people can feel shut out. So first, a little bit of background into the project, which really inspired why we're here today. Last summer, London's mental health partnership, Thrive London, commissioned us to develop a campaign. And the aim of this campaign was to tackle poverty stigma, especially when it comes to accessing support for money and for mental well-being. It was really important for us that this campaign be shaped by the very people we set to target. So we ran 4 focus groups across London in community spaces and food banks, and we had a total of 51 participants help shape the campaign messaging, the visuals, and we landed on the Take What's Yours campaign. And you can see some of the designs from that campaign. And the message was simple: support is yours for the taking. We were really happy to have reached over 380,000 people through targeted social media ads that were also translated into 5 languages. And engagement was really promising. We had over 10,000 people click through to borough directories listing local support services. And the campaign was meant to end there. But we had so much of this data from focus groups, and we really didn't want those voices to fade out once the campaign ended. And what became really clear during those discussions was that stigma was only part of the story. People began raising challenges that we hadn't fully anticipated, and about what it actually felt like trying to access support. And so that sets the stage for what inspired this webinar. And today, alongside the focus group insights, you'll also hear clips from Miss Begum and her mother, who took part in one of the focus groups, and who I emailed the participants asking them if they would like to be interviewed in more detail about their experience navigating support. And I broke down the findings into 4 sections. We have pre-engagement barriers, engagement barriers, the consequences, and what people say need to change. So starting off with some pre-engagement barriers, the things that make it difficult for people to even begin asking for help. So I asked the group some agree or disagree questions to get the ball rolling. I asked them, is it difficult to talk about money? And mostly everyone across all of the groups agreed. Each group brought up things like feeling embarrassed, feeling shame. When it came to conversations around benefits, for example, one mom talked about feeling judged for being on benefits by other mothers at the school. Another talked about job seekers being seen as losers and not wanting to go to the job center for this reason. There also seemed to be a understanding that there was the right kind of benefit claimant. For example, it felt like people had to justify that they had worked all of their lives and fell on hard times. And these people may be categorized as the deserving type, and other people were maybe seen as conning the system. But what we realized throughout these conversations was that stigma was not the only pre-engagement barrier, but also not the most significant. So many people don't look for support simply because they don't know what help is available or where to go for support. So for example, when Mrs. Begum's husband died, her daughter had to take over and had no clue what her mother needed. So this is what she had to say.
My mom, she turned pension age last year, February, her 66th birthday. And it was like, no one told us that we would have to, because mum gets state pension, we didn't know. We thought that everything was going to be the same. Nothing would really change. It's just the amount that she gets would change from universal credit to pension. And we didn't know what state pension meant. We didn't know what pension credit meant. We find out that she's not entitled to the full housing benefit. She's not entitled to the full council tax. She has to pay herself to make up for the shortfall. We had no idea how to calculate anything. Mum's not well. She's deaf, hard of hearing. We lost my dad. And my dad was the one that used to take care of all of this stuff. So imagine like knowing that, you know, she's going to have to like pay, and we didn't know how that would work out. And they didn't tell us a thing. They just kind of like expected you to know.
So this was a common topic that was brought up at the focus groups, and also what the campaign was trying to address. We were trying to address stigma, but also trying to show people that support is available to them and they can take what's theirs. But throughout the conversations, we were missing a key part, which is access to the support services. So what one of the participants said, I feel like really gets to the heart of the issue. Money is out there that people are eligible for, but no one tells you about it and it's difficult to access. So that leads us into some of the engagement barriers that people talked about. What happens when people actually try to get help? So this is where the focus group discussions, I think, became most lively. When we talk about accessibility barriers, language was a huge issue. People speaking English as their second language, not being misunderstood by staff because of their language, or not understanding certain materials because they weren't translated, and relying on family members to translate for them. And this is the case with Miss Begum and her mother, that she's translating for her mother and translating those experiences. Another huge barrier was digital exclusion. We gave people digital vouchers to thank them for joining the focus group and participating. But then we realized that some people don't have emails that we could send them to. People don't have certain computer skills required to navigate the system. I mean, I'm someone who has a lot of digital skills, and sometimes navigating the UC system online is so confusing. So really imagine if you don't even have an email, how much more difficult that would be. And one of the participants, for example, he came to me after and he said, I want to apply to a job. I have my CV, but I don't know how to attach it to my email. And I think with these kind of hitting a wall barriers, you see that people want to get help, but they're met with these things that stop them from getting that support. And other things can make it more difficult. Sight, hearing impairments, those further intensify digital exclusion. Dyslexia, people said that it was hard for them to understand complicated information. And then having mental health issues, it just makes navigating the system so much more overwhelming. And those accessibility barriers can be often made worse by how systems are designed. So there was common frustrations about experiences with untrained staff, unclear instructions, misleading guidance, rushed interactions. People felt like they were being rushed out of the door. And a lot of people mentioned just the lack of services in general, especially compared to what they experienced in the past. So Miss Begum, for example, recalls a time where there were more activities when she was growing up in the 90s. And her mom reminded her that youth clubs exist, which we now know are decreasing exponentially. So we can hear more about their experience with that.
It was very hard getting in contact with the council. The rent support team wasn't very supportive. And then I finally had to make some sort of complaint. And then they kind of like said, okay, we could, give your mum a rent card, and a council tax book where she could make her monthly payments. And I said, you guys are going to have to do something, because she's not used to this, and she can't just pay you a lump sum she doesn't have. So you're going to have to give her something that she could pay in installment. They kind of like, yeah, that's the only thing they did, but only because we had to kind of like put our foot down, not because they did it from the get-go. And then when I tried to look for support and help, we couldn't get appointments. I tried to call Age UK. I remember at one point they said, yeah, we can come on this date, which would be like a month and a half along the line, and it would be somewhere totally different from where we live. Mum's got mobility; she was on a wheelchair, so just getting her from A to B would be an issue. So they said, call Citizens Advice Bureau. The Citizens Advice Bureau are so hard to get through. I mean, I've emailed them, I didn't get a response, and you call them from 9 a.m. early in the morning, and you could be on the phone for 2 hours.
So I think it's really what she's saying is getting to that even when support exists, the journey to reach it is complicated and it can be very discouraging. I'd like to note that Ms. Begum also said that she knows that these organizations that she mentioned serve their importance. It's just that, when services are overstretched, these are the consequences. And when people repeatedly encounter these kind of barriers, the consequences, they build up. So classic financial consequences, people missing out on benefits. We had someone from the group say after 15 years, they realized that whole time they were eligible for disability benefits but had no idea. People were losing out on transitional support. And in the case of Mrs. Begum, she ended up being in rent arrears for 6 months because things weren't communicated well enough to her. And we also can't underscore the effect that these barriers have on people's emotional state. And Miss Begum talks about that and what her and her mother experience.
Oh, mom did express like the worries and the anxieties, not sleeping, not knowing what's going to happen next. And also it just made us feel like, well, I'm speaking personally from my own point of view, but a little bit useless and helpless. Yeah, it did. I just felt like, oh gosh, like, what am I meant to do? Like, what am I meant to do? Where do I start? And I
Yeah.
kept waking up every morning, like so much anxiety, so much like not knowing where to go, where to start. It was just such a horrible phase.
So these experiences, these barriers, these consequences over time, they start shaping how people view the system itself. So in the group, there were a lot of common beliefs, such as services were intentionally withholding information, that systems were actively working against them, that support can make things worse. There was also some mistrust in the councils. If they would get council letters, that they would fear that they would be negative and they may not want to open it. So these beliefs come from repeated negative experiences of trying to navigate the system. And after one of the focus groups, I found this sticky note that I'd like to read. It says, "The worst kind of injustice is the one delivered by the very system tasked and entrusted with preventing it." I think many of us in this room, why we came here today is because we want to help people. We want to be engaged in this conversation. But I think what this person wrote is a reminder that good intentions aren't enough. And I think the question becomes, what do we need to do to change to make sure that we are just, that we are building trust, and that we are upholding our end of the bargain? So what is needed to improve service delivery and design? The participants gave a lot of practical suggestions, clearer guidance, where to go, what happens next, warm referrals where people are connected to the right person who is expecting them, ready to give them assurance, accessibility improvements like translated information, face-to-face options, clear phone numbers, not relying just on QR codes, and also just not feeling rushed out of the door, having empathy and warmth. And Ms. Begum describes the empathy and warmth that she received, that her and her mother received at community spaces. So I'm going to play that clip here.
She said that they were very good to her. She's going to the Cardinal Hume Center, like she's saying that they saved her, like that her mental state, it was very messy. And they helped. And what I'm saying about the Abbey Center, it's the same. It's just very like they're not judgmental at all. And I've met so many people there now that I've become friends with, that we just go there. We go there for a cup of tea or like a coffee, go and have our lunch there now. And there's other services that we've accessed in the Abbey Center because of me going to do that one thing for Universal Credit. So they have like a food pantry there on a Friday. Yeah, so I go there on a Friday when I can, whenever I can. And they have other, like they have like sewing classes, and they have like gardening club, and like obviously like my mum loves all of that stuff.
Yeah.
So, yeah, like we've opened up a can of worms.
And to end off my conversation with Ms. and Mrs. Begum, I asked what they would want decision makers to understand about what people are going through and what could actually make a difference. And this is what she said.
I don't feel like the big dogs don't. Maybe they understand it, but they can't feel what we're feeling because they're not going through it. They're just like the mouthpiece for whatever party they're in. To feel it is to live it, or to know someone that's lived it, or just to feel it a little bit is to like feel it, like live it a little bit, if not a lot. Because they don't feel it, they're not gonna have support systems out there that they would feel like, oh gosh, this would work. I think they should listen to the people and what the people want, number one. And number two, they should fund the community more and let the community leaders take lead with the community, rather than just, hiring like people to take care of things in that community. It should be It should be led by the residents and the community, because that's where we know what we need and we know how to run. Like if we had a chance, we would take care of our own community and our own people. I feel like that needs to come back, because we had that a very long time ago, and that stopped somewhere along the line. I don't know when it stopped, but it did stop. We need that back again. We need a community-led council.
So we started this work with the campaign last summer, and the focus was really on stigma, but listening to people's experiences brought the conversation to access. And I hope it's a reminder or reflection that if we engage with communities, listening is where it has to begin. So thank you so much, and I'll hand it back to Lisa now.
Hi, so I'm doing a little re-record of the presentation that I made at the Changing the Conversation webinar this morning. A couple of technical hitches, but also because we were running late, I felt like I rushed it a bit and didn't quite do it justice. So I want to make sure that we've captured the information in a way that is useful to people as much as possible. Just to reintroduce myself, I'm Jeff Mitchell. I'm the Managing Director and founder of Clean Slate Training and Employment, and also of Quids In magazine and Quids In Money Guidance. My part in this event and this presentation really is going to look more at sort of where it all came from, why it has become something of a passion project on my part, to try and bring together partners across different sectors engaged in service delivery or policy formation, to really try to think about ways that we can change the conversation, but re-engage parts of our community who feel left in the dark and left behind. It comes back full circle really to Tom's presentation earlier about storytelling around the campfire, but also I may have taken that a little bit too much to heart in this presentation, as you will see from the way that I presented it, but bear with me. I just really wanted to share some insights really. I was asked to so over the last few years, I've been producing regular blogs for our Quids In Professional Network newsletter. And one of the stories that I told was about thinking back to a school trip when I was in primary school, and how we did, human crocodile. We went 10 minutes down the road and we ended up on this estate that was the council estate where I lived. And I'm sure with some of the best intentions, the teacher was describing the sort of the history of the estate, but also, how this is where poor people live. This is shoddy housing, and not a nice place to live. And I was stood there thinking, I can see the window to my bedroom. I feel like I've got a lot to say about this. But it really wasn't an opportunity. I felt a little bit humiliated and embarrassed, and not part of that conversation, and quite alienated from it. Later on in my school career, when I had gone into further education, I was the first in my family to do that. And I remember the day that I suddenly realized that almost everyone else in the room was on track to go to university. It was never questioned. It was something that people from the families of the students who were there in sixth form were automatically going to go to university. And I just thought, am I supposed to be here? That's not my plan. Maybe I should have just gone back to work. And again, it's another example of how, without saying anything, those cues are presented that kind of say, no, you're not part of this, or you're not part of this conversation. And it's really stuck with me. And I think that one of the things that stood me in good stead is a personality trait to be quite defiant. If someone tells me I can't do something, I often start with the reaction, I bet I could. And in this case, after a couple of years working in a bank and realizing I hated that, I decided I was going to give higher education a go, and wanted to become a journalist. So I took that step. I remember having a small argument with my mum, who was saying, well, why would you want to do that? That's not, you've already exceeded what anyone else in the family has done. So it wasn't really with support, but it was a sense that actually I could still advance myself through that route, and through university. And then when I did get to university, and I was at what is now Bath Spa University, I set up a student magazine, and sort of recruited some people to sort of join me in that venture. And one of the things that we were doing was campaigning on homelessness, and in turn that led to me becoming part of the launch team of the Big Issue Southwest, and where I later became a director, and then ultimately became managing director at the Big Issue in London. But when I left the Big Issue, it was to set up Clean Slate Training and Employment. The idea was to create and support employment opportunities for people facing barriers to work, inspired really by Big Issue vendors who were doing a day's work, earning their own money, despite sometimes the worst circumstances, living under a bridge and then going out and doing a day's work and earning your own money. And it just got me thinking there must be so many sort of false barriers in the way of people getting into employment. So I set up Clean Slate to try and help them. But once I'd done that, and we were getting established in the Bristol area, it occurred to me that actually employment for people facing those barriers was part of a bigger conversation about helping people to become better off. And I got involved with the Bristol Financial Inclusion Task Force, and was saying, look, yes, access to financial services should be more equal, more equitable, but part of that story should also be employment. And to be fair, they welcomed that extension of their brief. But then I got involved with those conversations about, how cash machines on those council estates, like the one that I'd grown up on, would charge to use them. That doorstep lending was the norm, and people in lower income households were less likely to know where they could get affordable credit, for example, or debt advice. And treated as more convenient would have been were the catalogues and the rent to buy furniture places like Bright House, which were just on the edge of those estates, whereas Argos or somewhere else that might be cheaper would, in the long run, would be further afield. And also that broadband wasn't, the coverage wasn't reaching, and still doesn't reach, some rural areas where people are struggling or in financial hardship. But at the time, it wasn't a priority for those areas to be well served. And so people were kind of trapped in the poverty trap, but also trapped in terms of not receiving information. And this was 20 years ago, not receiving information and feeling and turning to sort of high cost alternatives to get by. So I thought about how I could make a contribution and how we could address that situation and try and level the playing field. Drew on my publishing experience at the Big Issue, and worked with a few publishers from the local area, notably Future Publishing based in Bath. And we took a sort of publisher's approach to creating a new magazine that would aim to go through every letterbox and every door on every council estate across the UK, helping people realise that help is out there, how debt advice works, how where affordable loans were available, how to shop around, how to get the support that's available, how benefits work as well. But we started with the consumer. So as an enterprise, we thought about who is the consumer and what do they need to know. And we took the information that was being provided or being sort of, if it was handed out anywhere, it was coming from government or local authorities or citizens' advice, for example. But then we reorganized how it was shared, made it less hard, less complex to understand, and then put it into the format of something that will be more familiar, which would look like something like a supplement to a tabloid newspaper, or like Take a Break. And so Quids-In was born. We knew that landlords at the time, so 2008, had a duty of care to communicate with and involve their tenants. And they were at the time producing quarterly newsletters, and Quids-In was designed to be a sort of slimline supplement that could be inserted into those newsletters. And in less than 2 years, we were reaching 250,000 plus low-income households, social tenant households. And we used celebrities on the cover, bold headlines, bright images, sometimes slightly titillating, and a kind of a call to action that sometimes appealed to people's fear of missing out. So one of my favorite stories that we ran was, 10 reasons the fat cats don't want us to be online, and then really spelling out the benefits of being online at a time when many people didn't necessarily buy into the benefits of being online in order to become better off. We also have, so come 2011, 2012, that duty of care on landlords was removed by the government. And at the same time, a lot of authorities and housing providers were moving to digital as the primary means to communicate with residents and tenants. And so the sort of viability of the magazine had to be replaced with something else, and we now have our Quids-In Readers Club, which works pretty much like the emails from Money Saving Expert, except that it's not for profit and dedicated to people on lower incomes. So we don't have any kind of ads or promotions for credit cards or ISAs and things like that that might be less appropriate for this target audience. Does it work as well as a magazine? It doesn't sit on people's kitchen worktop or on their coffee tables. It doesn't get flicked through. An email doesn't get flicked through to see if there's stuff you might want to come back to later. But in terms of does it work? Well, we're reaching 40,000 households through the Quids-In Readers Club, through the email service. And last time we ran a cost of living survey, we had about 1,100 responses, and those people told us that about 16% of people were reading something from our Readers Club emails and thinking, actually, that is something I do need to address with my finances. So we know that it is having an impact. We know that it is making a difference, and we can measure it more than we can with a printed publication, but it is a different prospect. So in terms of the conversations that are taking place at the moment, I think it's what we've learned, and what Madeline's presentation earlier sort of described, is that people feel a bit like they're not being listened to. They feel processed. Their experiences of what is happening is less through an email they receive from the local authority, which they might be less inclined to open, especially if they owe money for council tax, for example, or from their landlord. And more about what other people like them say to them and how they share information, but also how they see, what they hear, and what they feel in their local sort of neighborhoods. And that could be, and if it doesn't look like action is being taken, as far as people are concerned, no action is being taken. And I think that's also true of people who sort of applying for housing support or whatever. If it's a no, and there's no time to explain to them how prioritization works or whatever, the assumption is, oh, I've been told no, somebody else is going to get it instead. And all the kind of whispers coming from other sources of information is having, well, it's a bit like around the bigger bonfire, is having a bigger effect on people's perception of what's taking place. People select where they get information from. They do prioritize people like me, in terms of, not me personally, but people like them, and are probably more suspicious or skeptical about information from institutions, for example. And, you know, the other messengers are sort of cutting through in a way that as professionals and as institutions and service providers, we can't always get equal billing there. One of the things that we do at Clean Slate, and we have done since the start, is really value people who have come to us in hardship, come through our service, lifted themselves out of hardship, got all the help that they are entitled to, and then are in a position to train up. So we recruit, we train, we mentor, and we employ them as experts for their lived experience. I do acknowledge that lived experience is starting to become treated as a bit of a wet log, as Tom described earlier. So being dropped onto a bonfire and kind of creating more smoke than warmth. But it is an important concept. It is an important principle that we are going to stick with at Clean Slate, because it makes all the difference. So once somebody has been able to put on their own oxygen mask, we help them put on their oxygen mask. They are then able to help others from a similar situation. And it really cuts through. They have more time to spend building rapport and trust, and they know what people are going through, and that just comes across, and they really understand it. It's part of our promise to the communities we work with. Our promise that we made a few years ago says, we see you, we hear you, we are you. We know that the people we work with who are struggling financially don't feel seen, they don't feel listened to. And in terms of being part of our organization, we do it through Elements. We recruit them to join our teams. We also listen to them through surveys, as I mentioned, the cost of living survey, and sort of feedback processes. That means that we've always got that kind of ear to the ground about what it is that people need and their perceptions really of what we're doing, but also what other organizations are doing. And we've now got to a position where through our Elements program, 60% or more of our money coaches who work one-to-one with people in hardship have come through that program. They have that lived experience. They're now professionals providing a systematized money health check and money coaching process that we've pinned down, and we are scaling up, and we're able to scale up across the UK in similar ways, working in partnership with others. But we now have the majority of our money coaches have come from that background, which is really important to us. Don't take my word for it. I spent some time the other day with Emma, who has recently completed our peer worker training on the Elements program, and she explains how important it has been to her. Firstly, getting information from others who have a similar background to herself or a similar history as herself, but also how she loves being able to sort of pay that forward, if you like.
Now, I attended a treatment centre, which I'm quite open about, for addiction. And coming out of there, after having 6 months of being institutionalised, I'd say, which was great. My life today is very good. I've turned things around. It was a real struggle because the rehab sort of cut you off then. They did provide a small aftercare service, but not. So I had to look at housing, I had to look at finances, I had to look at how to look at employment, I had to look at where to get food from, a food bank from, the whole shaboodle. And for somebody that had never ever in her life at the age of 52, as I was then, it was a bit massive shock. I just didn't know where to turn. I was appointed to the Citizens Advice, which was a very, very complex and hard thing, in that you had to get an appointment, which was 2 months later down the road from when you first made contact, because they're so busy. I was a little bit fortunate that I did get advice of people that had gone before me. But yeah, there was a lot of stigma. I felt very, very much in the dark because there wasn't really any guidance or anybody out there. The local council, unless you were sleeping on the street, they didn't know what to give you advice. And then obviously it was in time that once I did manage to get myself a grant through a local charity in Cheltenham, from that I bought a laptop, and from that I started doing my own research. And because again, you've got this barrier of, you know, so many bits of paperwork to fill out, so many, you know, reasons that they're not just helping you, and so many times you're having to explain why, and they do look at you as though, and I don't think they really realize. I mean, yes, they're doing a job. They must meet lots and lots of people in the same position every day. So I do look at them sometimes and think, I don't know how you do your job, but on reflection, they have got a job to do, and they've got to sort of not show emotion to it. But it is very, very frustrating, very frustrating. And I don't think they realize, or do they realize, but not show it, that the rules and regulations they're having to follow to, and the processes and the policies and procedures aren't good enough. Unless you're really, really in it, I think I absolutely do, because I was naive to this in the world I used to live in until it happened to me. I had no idea how people struggled or what they went through. You know, I was from a nice middle-class, privileged white girl background, but once I'd had my whole life stripped, sorry, not ripped, of me, because I fell into addiction through whatever circumstances, I was just another person out there asking for help and not knowing or having any direction of where to go. It is only from me being out there and meeting people like me that I have learnt, oh, didn't know that existed. Oh, I didn't know about that. It was only as I started doing the peer mentoring course and understood the concept of how you bring people to work for you that have been through this process. I thought, what a great idea. Because, you know, it's people like me that have had that understanding of what it's like to have nothing and to have to go out and find it. The word you said is resourceful. I became very resourceful, even to the point where I have people ring me up now who've left the rehab because somebody's told them, oh, Emma can help you. Yeah, the general feel I got from people that came to sit down with the Clean Slate Peer Mentors was one of relief when they found that somebody would be able to make a phone call for them. As simple as that. If some people didn't have access to laptops or computers or know how to use their phones, you could see their relief that they had had a human being talking to them and, you know, guiding them. Some people are really, really desperate. It's awful. It is. And I've seen a lot of people go back to addiction or lose their lives. I'm being honest now, you know, because they feel that there is not enough out there to help them. I think compassion is needed. People to talk to are needed. People who've been in that situation and understand what they're going through. I think just, yeah, you know, just an ear to listen. But in this world we live in, nobody's got any time. You can't even get a GP appointment to talk to your GP if you're feeling down and low. It's just such too big an area to know exactly where to pinpoint change. But I think just to start in conversations is something.
It was great talking to Emma. I spent 40 minutes, I think we were chatting, and just that sort of real understanding, and I think more than empathy with what people are going through it really shines through. But it also, I think, brings to life the concept of lived experience and the importance of it. Just sort of coming to sort of winding up now, really, I think, you know, I was reflecting on what am I trying to get across in terms of my part of the presentation, but also bringing together the other speakers as part of this bigger webinar. I think understanding, you know, what the challenge is. I don't think we've necessarily got all the answers. I think there are things that Clean Slate does through its Elements program and people with lived experience, but also Quids In, speaking a very colloquial language, and making sure that sometimes complex issues are made easier to understand and presented in a way that people can sort of digest. That information is part of the solution, but it's not the whole solution. I mean, what exactly do we do when so many people who feel disaffected about politics, disaffected about how life is in the UK at the moment, you know, trust informal sources of news over official channels like emails from their local authority, or even if, you know, newsletters were produced or whatever, information from Job Centre Plus or from the government. There's just this sort of skepticism about information being shared in a way. As service providers and policymakers, how do we make sure people see and hear and feel that things are changing, and that change can be good when it happens? It's something that in our one-to-one conversations with people, very often who start in the process feeling hopeless about the future, suddenly through a few quick wins and by us engaging with them where they are and what they need right now, and working our way towards sort of bigger options that open bigger doors for them, that they start to buy into this idea that the process can be positive. But luckily, because of the system we use, active listening, that coaching, and also with so many people with lived experience, we do build sort of trust and rapport quite quickly, and it does help us sort of build that bridge. How do we stop people feeling left behind and left in the dark? You know, what are the communication options available to us, and which ones will be most effective? Because someone somewhere has got the ear of these big parts of our community. How do we compete with that? And it's pretty much the same conversation I had with credit unions and debt advice agencies and local authorities when we just started Quids In. It's like they said we can't compete with doorstep lenders and, you know, and Bright House with all their marketing spend. And we came up with the idea of Quids In magazine. So there must, you know, what is the next iteration of that? So finally, then, how are we going to change the conversation? How can we all collaborate and work together and become a sort of movement, really sort of pushing back to make sure we're engaging people? As Katie mentioned, I think there is a real strong argument for treating hardship, treating economic disadvantage as a protected characteristic, even if it's only a thought exercise. You know, if we are insisting people for maybe for an entry-level job have to come suited and booted, have to travel across a city to come to interview, and there's a cost involved, are we already working against against a sense of equity that, well, maybe that person will say, I just can't afford it, it's not worth it, I don't have the clothing. And I know that there are schemes and projects available to support people, but we have to think, is it necessary? Is there another way we could do this in a way that doesn't actually cost someone to get a job to become better off? I think we need to question our silence when ideas are being verbalized by the people using our services. I think we need to we need to meet people where they are and try to bring them with us, but we can't just let false assumptions, for example, about who gets a house, who gets housing allocations. We have to explain how that system works. We have to be leaders. We have to show leadership in communities. We have to engage with people. It is our job. We need to, I would say, have zero tolerance on intolerance, challenging any form of intolerance within services. It's not about telling people they're wrong. I think that's part of the wrong conversation. I think it's about engaging with people and explaining how things work so that people feel more in the know about, oh, it's not because someone's been prioritized over me because of their background, it's because this is how the housing system works, for example. We need to think about cultural sensitivity. I would say that there's a lens we can use to kind of check what we're sending out to people. We're kind of attuned to trying to be not be tone deaf when it comes to cultural sensitivity between people of different cultural backgrounds, but actually, and again, it was mentioned earlier, the issue of class is a real issue, and it is continued. And in the image on this slide, you can see that I'm using Google Translate to take a very bureaucratic and slightly tone deaf kind of it's an example from emails that I've seen for job seekers, and translating it into something that actually speaks to people who are more worried about keeping food on the table for their kids and keeping a roof over their head than they are in their career paths and their sort of skills portfolio and things like that. But sort of really considering language and making sure that we're not turning people off and making them feel like they're not part of this conversation in the way that I was as a kid in school, for example, on occasions. We also need to listen hard. So what Madeline was saying earlier about the community conversations, we learned so much from that. It reiterated and reinforced a lot of what we already understood anyway, but it gave us the evidence that we could then take to funders and to partners and say, and bring to this webinar to say, people need something different from us, and it is time. And so that listening is, you know, we talk about changing the conversation. A conversation is two-way, and we need to make sure we have, we're doing the listening in those conversations. We can be the bridge as a service provider, as policymakers, making sure that communities themselves and community organizations that are rooted there are key partners. They bring something that professional services and institutions or authorities can't necessarily deliver, especially to people who feel alienated from processes. And so those connections and those partnerships are essential. And also in the mix, we need to build a bridge from us to them and into specialist services. So debt advice, housing advice, so that people get the information they need in a timely way, and they don't feel like they're missing out because they're not clever enough, or they're not well informed enough, or well connected enough. We need to build those connections so that they can access the support that they need. There's also an example I would throw in here as well. I was a few years ago talking to a housing association that we were trying to place some of our job seekers into a sort of work placement, paid work placement with them. And it had been very successful. 2 individuals that we'd placed, one had got themselves out of a homelessness hostel during that time because she just felt that boost of confidence to take the next step, and another one went into full-time work, permanent work as a mental health support worker. But from the Housing Association's point of view, what was fed back to me was, yeah, it was good to do, we've done our bit. Basically, there's no other way to say this, our staff don't really want people like that working here. And I was like, but they're your tenants, how can this be? So I think as organizations, if we wouldn't employ people in hardship in the right role at the right time because of some kind of cultural disconnect, then there's something wrong with, I would say there's something wrong with the culture of our organization. So it's something, it's a good kind of check, sense check, I think, for any organizations that mean business about changing the conversation we're having with people. From our point of view, Quids In Professional Network, we want to work in partnership with as many different partners across different communities across the UK. We have services that we, as I mentioned earlier, they're sort of like systematized, and we're looking to scale up, working in partnership and training up those partners to deliver those services, especially bringing elements into other organizations so that people with lived experience get a structured entry into the world of support in the communities they come from. Come to more of our webinars, read our Professional Network newsletter each month. There is so much more we can do together, and we can be more than the sum of our parts by collaborating and finding ways to really try to engage people who feel left behind and left in the dark. And ultimately, let's just start changing the conversation and trying to push back and then win back the trust, the goodwill, the faith of the communities that feel like they need to turn elsewhere for those conversations. Those people who've gone to the big burning bonfire instead of the storytelling fireplace that we wanted to establish all along. Thanks for listening.